part of what Sujatha said spoke to me. I think that we can talk about cross-cutting identities, but I think that this really taps into one of the biggest problems that we have here today pushing for oversight and regulation of technology, is that there is no unified field, there's no unified movement, and unfortunately, we can phrase it in terms of rights. I think some people in the first panel talked about, human rights, and that is being the paradigm for pushing for oversight and regulation. And unfortunately, you can talk about individuals who want privacy rights, but those same individuals want reproductive rights in a certain respect. And I think that part of the problem, I think part of the problem is that we have a tendency right now, especially my generation, I think, to speak in terms of rights and to speak in terms of things as absolutes, when really the issues that we're dealing with affect various stakeholders in various ways, and there's a lot of difficulty when you try to build a broader movement with people, like you said, who are used to saying, I want the information so that I can say what's best for me. And personally, I think that part of the problems that we encounter are in the segmentation of the way that we're educated. And I think that from what I've seen in my peers, the biggest identifier that people feel isn't race or gender, the same way that it is your mission commitment to the field that you've kind of dedicated yourself to. Everyone has a BA these days. Everybody has gone to college. Everybody's formed their biggest identity around, I think, what they've studied, what they've kind of focused in on intellectually, professionally. And I think that the biggest differences we have a lot of times are between our philosophical ideas that are built in our education. And especially in bioethics, it's so easy to see it as a polarization between the scientists and the ethicists and the anthropologists and the public health, the activists. And in my opinion, the biggest challenge comes from that segmentation of the education. And I think that's something that would really help to bring in more of these various fields together in some sort of comprehensive educational structure at an undergraduate level. I think provides a better framework for discussing the politics of biotechnology.
Thank you for that. I think what kind of goes hand in hand with identities, which is what we've been focused on so far, is to think a little bit about the way that collectives are identified by institutions, organizations, industries. And so I think that one thing, to the extent that you've encountered it professionally, but I'm sure all of us have personally, is the way that youth is marketed to, in terms of many of these new sort of sexy genetic-based, consumer goods and communities, 23andMe, and so on. So to the extent that you have personally or professionally encountered the marketization of our age cohort, I would be interested to hear that experience, but also strategy for us as a collective to counter that.
Well, I can talk a little bit. So we've done a lot of work with young women around egg donation. And the thing that so invariably on any college campus nowadays, if you ask anybody, particularly the women, well, only the women, if you ask them, have you considered donating your eggs or selling your eggs, pretty much everybody raises their hand. And when you probe a little bit more, there really is the sense that they've grown up in such a market culture. We have grown up in such a market culture that we sell our skills, we sell our bodies, we market ourselves in the way we dress, in the way we look in our professional careers, that this is just an extension of that this is no different from all the other ways in which we have grown up commodified. And so to then draw some kind of line here, to them, it doesn't make sense.
At the risk of being repetitive and a little off topic, both at the same time, I suppose, is I think about the normalization of ART. It's some of the marketing is direct when I'm in the subway and I see the ads for the IVF clinics, and some of the changes in the way of thinking are conveyed much more in a more diffuse manner in popular culture and so forth. But I'm entering into my the second half of my 30s, as are many of my friends, and the extent to which IVF is seen as almost the norm. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say that it is the norm, but it is not abnormal anymore. And that, getting back to what Sujatha said about having it all, some people I know who do focus on building up that career just assume, well, yeah, I'll undergo IVF, or maybe I'll freeze my eggs, which is the latest spin in the last couple of years.
Can I just add to the second part of your question, which is what do we do about this? So when I think about the challenge around egg donation, I also feel like we haven't done a good enough job of contextualizing the experience, right? So where is it that we are asking young women, why is it that this is your best economic option for getting through college, right? Why is freezing your eggs your best economic option around your career, right? Why is it that you have to build your career essentially during your most fertile years, and then you don't have family-friendly workplace policies, right? So we can't expect change behavior unless we change the context in which people are making these decisions, in which we are making these decisions. And that requires a much broader social movement. And it requires, at least for around the issue of egg donation, it requires a women's movement that we don't currently have.
Yeah, surely no one's going to be asking people with disabilities to donate eggs. So this is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around, I guess. I think the issue that our community is facing is sort of in the opposite direction, of people who want to use this technology and are meeting with resistance from IVF clinics and so on. And so as to what to do about it, I have some anecdotal thoughts as far as within my work with Little People of America. We did come out with a policy statement about using IVF and not as a deliberate way to have infants with dwarfism, but rather having the option to use IVF and implant embryos with dwarfism through PGD. And the reason why we wrote this policy statement is that within our community, a big problem is the double dominance problem, where if a embryo has two dominant genes for dwarfism, a lot of times the survival rate is very, very low, and it involves a lot of physical pain and so on. And so where our community can say dwarf pride, there's nothing wrong with having dwarfism. This is a challenge when two people get together and want to reproduce. And so I guess there has been some folks sort of talking about the use of this technology to avoid the double dominance problem, but at the same time don't want to be told, well, you can't implant the dwarf embryos, right? And so I guess this complicates, the sort of canned disability critique of oh, it's always oppressive to use reproductive technology and so on. And it also challenges some of the canned media representations of this, of all those deaf people and people with dwarfism just want to try to, make more of themselves and so on. And so I guess the context, again, I would echo what you just said, Sujatha, about it being really important to look at people's motivations and sort of why they're trying to use this technology in certain ways.
I'll throw out one more question and then give you all a chance to cross-question if you have any lingering, or pose some to everyone. And so my sort of last thing that I'd like to throw out is this idea that someone mentioned earlier this afternoon. To some extent, we're all educators, whether inside or outside the classroom, and posed with challenges of communicating what we're talking about here, where there's some shared, discourse, some shared language, and being able to translate it in many different kinds of venues. And so I would be interested to hear what kind of barriers, what kind of strategies in terms of communicating with the younger generation that we're sort of describing here about some of the issues that we're going to spend the next day and a half, 2 days talking about. What kinds of strategies in terms of case studies, in terms of language, in terms of what to avoid, in terms of starting points, talking points, to put it crudely, that could be of use to the different kinds of educators that we have in the room today?
Well, I guess we've all just been speaking anecdotally, but just having these debates with some of my friends, both who are studying the sciences and who aren't, I think that the kinds of arguments that resonate the least are when we focus on symbolic or moral harms. I think the problem is that that's what changes the most through the generations and with time. And I think that the arguments that actually hit home the most are when we find examples of how the technology has translated into actual economic, concrete harms for people. I think one of the issues that I worked on this summer was surrogacy, and discussing that overview of the gestational surrogacy market in America with people from my class. The thing that people that were the most shocked by was the high rate of multiple pregnancy and the high rate of medical complication that not only because it faces women who choose to be surrogates more than it faces women who conceive naturally, but also the fact that this information is just not presented to these people who choose to enter this market. And so finding concrete examples of exactly how the people are exploited, because exploitation can be vague, but trying to find concrete examples like that, saying, they suffer complications in their pregnancy, instead of talking about the moral harms that come from exploitation of surrogates. These are specific examples that actually resonate with people in ways that moral harms may not, as valid as they might be as arguments, abstractly.
No, please.
So one of the challenges that I've noticed in the intergenerational communication is to start with a critique of the technology as if it were all bad, right? Either the doomsday scenarios of, Gattaca and, all the terrible things that are going to happen. And I think, well, partly what happens is people tune us out because technology is so much a part of our lives, particularly information technology. And for as much as there's been a critique around the internet and privacy issues, people on a daily basis experience the benefits of it. So as much as Facebook has been criticized around their privacy policies, not many people have left Facebook, right? And so to start with a real hardcore critique of the technologies has not been a conversation starter. And I even feel, so when I think about either assisted reproductive technologies or the technologies around personal genomics, it seems like there's a real political opportunity So just in the way that the ancestry tests both reify the notion of a biological race, they also completely deconstruct the idea of a biological race. So, right, so somebody finds out that, oh, now they're 20% Native American. They lived their whole life without knowing that. So what does that mean? And I feel like that's the political moment that we can take advantage of talking about all the ways in which it deconstructs and constructs. And the same thing around ARTs and family formation. Just in the ways that it reifies biological connection as family, it also completely deconstructs it in terms of, well, now you have an egg donor and a surrogate and, you know, different intended parents, right? So now family is looking very different, or the 56 siblings through the same sperm donor. Like, what does family mean in that context? And so, to me, that becomes a conversation starter of how is it that these technologies are raising complex questions, challenging what we thought we knew, and then what are the forces at play that are trying to push certain messages?
Do you have questions for each other? If not, an answer or thoughts around that last one?
Yeah, I guess I would echo what Lena, is that your name? What Lena just said about pointing toward sort of concrete harms. Again, the example that I'm coming back to is this issue of double dominance within the dwarfism community. One of the big intergenerational challenges that LPA faced when this came up was that a lot of the older generation just didn't want to touch it at all. Didn't want to say anything about assistive reproductive technology one way or the other, just because it was such a hot button issue regarding the status of embryos and fetuses. And so that was the sort of standard response that we were getting from LPA's board, which was, of course, all folks that were not part of the generation of folks that were actually doing the reproducing. And so what we did was we presented it in terms of the study that at the time had just come out from Johns Hopkins, the survey study about whether or not IVF clinics would use PGD to implant embryos with disabilities. And overwhelmingly, of course, the study showed that they would not. And so what we did was we went to our board and said, okay, well, you don't want to talk about this. You want to sort of have this libertarian approach of, you know, well, everybody can decide for themselves what they think about this, with, you know, the Roe v. Wade arguments in the background of their experience. And we said, well, look, this is, you know, a type of technology that can help our community, that the potential of it is being, you know, ignored or harmed by not taking a strong stand on it.
A couple of scattered thoughts here. I find it strange that I have a more difficult time speaking about these issues often with people of my own generation than those who are older. And I think Lena really touched on something here about the direct harms. Two aspects of my generational cohort come to mind about why many of us are so pragmatic. One may perhaps be the tightening of economic conditions among the reasonably privileged, and that's somewhat contradictory. But when the cost of living in urban areas skyrocket and the price of tuition increases at the rate it has, there is somewhat of a contradiction that those privileged enough to attend elite and reasonably sub-elite universities come out of these schools with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And so symbolic harms become secondary. A second thread that comes to mind might be if I had to pin a defining characteristic of my generational cohort, I think Jedediah Purdy did a good job of describing the nature of ironic detachment in our generation. He's a young author, and I recommend some of his books. There's something about being sincerely concerned about a so-called symbolic harm among many people, let's say under 40 or whatnot, that it's seen as, I don't know, a hang-up or whatnot. And so the question quickly becomes, yeah, well, what's the more direct harm? And the tricky thing is that at the margin, and this is the Facebook question, all this stuff, step by step, is good, right? I mean, why shouldn't I provide eggs for, there's a couple who want to have a kid. I get $20,000, $15,000 to help cover my student debt, step by step. So the challenge often is to convey the long term. And I think a very effective communication device among the people I speak with is pop culture. You can say, what's wrong with donating eggs, but you just say the word Gattaca and then everything clicks.
So if I may just, in 1 minute, just present this as an exercise that is indicative of what this entire 3-day process has been, and that is, as Deborah Greenfield mentioned earlier, to address our differences and these fault lines head on, as opposed to speaking around them, and really carry this over to the many breakout sessions we're going to have in terms of the many fault lines in addition to age that may make the differences between us vis-a-vis these technologies pronounced.
Thank you, all of you. That was so fascinating.